afternoon. It's Monday, April the 8th. We're expecting a partial solar eclipse here in Florida this afternoon, but I'm out at one of my favorite little spots south of Leesburg. It's a Buddhist meditation garden, sponsored by Vietnamese American Buddhist tradition here in the area. I thought it would be fun to come out on location and kind of highlight some of the things that I want to talk about today. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that at some point I wanted to talk about the spiritual practices associated with embroidery and other fiber arts. It's always been a fascination for me that not only is embroidery and various fiber arts used as decoration or as embellishment, but they can also be used as part of a spiritual practice. And pretty much every tradition in the world has a vibrant embroidery tradition that goes along with it, that helps folks who understand and appreciate that tradition practice their faith, think about the things that they believe, put into actual practice with their hands and their bodies the precepts and the concepts that are valuable to them as part of their religious practice. The other thing that's part of my history is that when I started teaching at the community college here in Florida, I developed a course on world religions. I've always been fascinated by the different belief structures that people all over the world have practiced. I find that not only does it help me to understand my own faith a little better and give me a point of comparison, but of course it helps me to understand why different cultures and groups behave the way they do. It helps us to find some common ground, because all of the world's great living religions really do have similar concepts of peace and cooperation and positive attributes. So as we begin the video today, you see some images, and I showed off some embroidery that I found pretty much just with a quick survey of the internet, related to the three religious groups that started in the subcontinent of India. And I think over the next few episodes, however many times I decide to talk about this, I want to look just very briefly at the concepts that are associated with these various religious traditions, and at the same time highlight some of what I've seen in terms of embroidery and practice that's associated with them. Of course, the Indian subcontinent has some of the oldest religious concepts that are still being practiced. Hinduism is still alive and vibrant and active in India and other parts of the world, of course. And as far as we can trace back to the Vedic literature, which goes back even before writing, it's some of the oldest traditions that we know of. Now, Hinduism, and I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of information on these different traditions. If you want to dig deeper, I hope you'll do that. Hinduism is a monistic tradition. That is, they believe in a creator god, usually called Brahma or something along those lines. But underneath that creator god, they have a myriad of lesser god figures who represent different attributes of the Godhead. And that's probably what most people are most familiar with when they think about Hinduism. The sacred cows, various god figures, some quite comforting and loving, others rather warlike and scary. In the slides that I've showed you, I started out with an embroidered work of Ganesh, the god that looks like a little elephant. One of the stories that goes along with Ganesh is that he was in danger of being killed by the evil one, and in order to protect him, they switched his head out with that of a little baby elephant so that he wouldn't be a threat anymore. Ganesh is a wonderful figure in this tradition, and many people attribute miracles to the god Ganesh. And so you will often see in temples and in homes, in people's individual worship areas, images of the various gods that are hand done in embroidery. And I know I visited India about 4 years ago because I was so fascinated by all these images and smells and sounds. And I brought back one image of Ganesh that I found there. And I couldn't find it this morning, but I'm hoping to dig up a video where I was actually doing some stitching using silk threads. Not on a religious piece, but on a piece that I helped to work on just a little bit there in Agra in India, where the Taj Mahal is located. So you see images of the god Ganesh. You often see in Hinduism embroidered images of the symbol Om. Om is considered to be the kind of universal sound of the universe, or the background sound that ties all living things together. So the second image there is the picture of Om, and then there was an embroidered piece of one of the gods that looks like a cow, because you know in India, in Hindu tradition at least, cows are sacred. I look at these images, and though they may be striking and unusual from my standpoint as a Westerner, I feel the need to be respectful of them. I used to tell my students in world religion classes, talk about other religions as if the person sitting next to you were a member of that tradition. Don't necessarily denigrate what other people believe. It may not line up with you, but it should help to illuminate and help you to understand the principles of your own tradition. So Hinduism goes way, way back, probably the oldest still continuous living religion that we know of. A religious tradition that began in India, but which is largely not practiced there anymore, is Buddhism. And as I said to you, I'm in a Buddhist meditation garden here that's sponsored by Vietnamese Americans in Florida. Buddhism spread beyond India and is very prominent in other parts of Asia. There are large Buddhist communities in the United States and all throughout the West. Buddhism is one of the few religions that actually goes out and kind of broadcasts what they believe, and though they may not be really considered evangelical, they do look to spread their beliefs and talk about what they believe. Buddhism is not a tradition that believes in a creator God. Buddha is the perfect kind of teacher figure. He's a bodhisattva, they call him. And he reached nirvana by escaping the wheel of birth and death and rebirth. And reincarnation is an important part of these traditions that are represented in India. So the pieces that I have at the beginning that help you to think a little bit about embroidery and what would be included in the iconography of Buddhist traditions would be various images of the Buddha. At the end of this video, I've gone around and showed you some of the statues and some of the things that are here in the meditation garden, and mostly what you see are various images of Buddha. You can see fat Buddhas and skinny Buddhas, and you can see Buddha reclined, sometime even Buddha in death. And these are important images for Buddhists. The wheel is another image that you'll often see embroidered or put on Buddhist traditional fabrics. That refers to that wheel of suffering and death and rebirth that Buddhist teaching tries to help us to get out of, to reach nirvana, which is a perfect state where you don't have to suffer anymore. And finally, an important image in Buddhism is the lotus flower. And the sixth slide and the third one representing Buddhism gives you an image of that. So what I'm suggesting is that as we look at these various traditions and as we look at the symbols that are stitched, when people sit down and do this hand stitching, and I would represent most of this as hand done work. If it's machine done, that's a whole nother equation. But if it's hand stitched, then it can be considered an act of devotion to represent with our hands sacred objects, sacred symbols, sacred persons, we are in some way recreating the tradition or the faith that is associated with those symbols. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time later on. I'll probably spend a whole episode on Christian symbolism and how that survived through the Dark Ages in many ways because of the stitching traditions that were associated with the Catholic Church. But I think we can see it as a universal principle that when people sit down and seek to replicate images that are considered sacred with their hands, and in our case with fiber and thread and that sort of thing, they are actually practicing devotion and giving prominence to the sacred in their lives. How many times really in the course of a busy week do you stop and just think about important principles? I mean, you're busy driving, or you're busy remembering what you got to get at the grocery store, or whatever it is that may keep us busy during the day. The act of stitching, the act of creating using fiber and threads, forces us to slow down, and usually it forces us to think a little bit about what we're stitching. So if you were stitching the sacred Om figure from Hinduism, you might find yourself actually making that sound. If you've ever done yoga or meditation, you perhaps have been led through an exercise where you make the sound of Om as a way of kind of tying you in. We talk a lot about the meditative value of stitching and of handwork. And it's even more prominent when you think about it with respect to a religious tradition. So I think that's a wonderful way to look at these various ideas. And it was surprisingly easy for me to find embroidery that was associated with every one of the world's great living traditions. There are at least 10 major religious movements that are still in existence, including Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that I'll talk about a good bit later in the series because they're younger traditions than some of these others we're looking at. Buddhism began in the 6th century BCE, and there was Judaism. There was the Abrahamic tradition at that point, but that was long before the ministry of Jesus and Christianity. So we're talking huge amounts of people all around the world, and we're talking about traditions that reach way, way back. The third tradition that I'll mention just briefly that's associated with India, but which is very little known here in the United States, is the tradition of Jainism. It's similar in some ways to Hinduism. They believe in reincarnation, and they look for ways to escape the suffering of the world. I guess what's most distinctive about Jainism, and maybe one of the things that you would recognize if you were to read up on it a little bit, is the extreme nonviolent stance that you will see in Jainism. If you know anything about Mahatma Gandhi and the tradition that he helped to found of nonviolent protest, you should understand that a lot of the principles of that came from Jainism. There would be two groups of Jains, and there are some practicing Jains in the United States, of course. The householder or the everyday practicer of Jainism probably wouldn't go to real extreme lengths to practice their tradition, but would look for ways to try to preserve life, try to be bring as little harm to the world and to living beings as possible. But those who practice Jainism in its most fervent form would be against the loss of life of any kind at any time. So you would see a real strict practicing Jain perhaps wearing a face mask over their face or at least over their mouth so that they would not ingest microorganisms that might be harmed. They would sweep the ground in front of their feet so that they would not accidentally step on an ant or a bug or another living being. Again, perhaps a tradition that seems very strange and exotic to us, but which for millions of people is a way of life. And I included at the very end of the slideshow a couple of pieces that represent sacred art and sacred representation from the Jain tradition. Anytime you go into a temple, anytime you go into a place of worship, almost anywhere in the world, with almost any religious tradition, I think you're likely to find this wonderful handwork that we practice, fiber art, stitching, and you're likely to see something that is an act of devotion. A chance for someone who believes strongly in reincarnation or the Buddha or the idea of nonviolence or any of the other great religious traditions of the world, and has taken the time to sit down and with their hand and with threads and needles and fabric tried to represent the core of that faith. I'll spend some time traveling to the Far East, and I'll also look at some of the monotheistic traditions here in the West that we know much better. But for today, this is Gary Sly. This is the Legacy of Handmade Objects, and I've been talking some about religious traditions and how they are practiced through embroidery in the Indian subcontinent. Have a great day. Bye-bye.